All right, everyone, we're about to get started. So if you could take your seats, we're gonna get started.
I want to go all the time. So she can monitor it.
Yeah.
Everyone got a pen and a notebook.
All right. I want to first thank everyone who's able to make it here today. All our guests who are here in person, all our guests who are here virtually. I want to thank our speakers who are here today, those who are here virtually. We have William Davison and Dr. Kindeya. Both of them are currently in East Africa. It's very late at night for them, so really grateful and gracious to them for coming and joining us today. We have two in-person speakers. One is on the way. So first, what I'll do is I'll give a little background into the format of how we're going to structure this. We're going to have 4 speakers, 2 virtual, 2 in person. So 4 presentations. While they're doing those presentations, everyone should have a note card. If you don't have a note card, we'll get one to you. If you have a question, you can write down that question, and then at the end of this discussion, we'll have those note cards brought to the front, and then your question will get answered. So with that being said, I will invite our first speaker to the front. That is Dr. Ezekiel Gebissa. He is a professor at PhD of history from Michigan State, professor of history and African studies at Kettering University. He's the author of Leaf of Allah, Kat, and the Transformation of Agriculture in Hararghe, Ethiopia, and a strong voice in the Oromo community. And he will give the first presentation today. So let's give him a warm welcome, please.
Pathway to violence. But before considering the pathway to violence, I'd like to talk about, as I said, about the violence in Tigray, to put it in perspective, to understand the nature, the magnitude, and the consequence of the violence, in order to imagine a workable pathways to peace. And I want to emphasize at this point in time, from where we are in Ethiopia, ending the bloodshed is more pressing than searching pathways to a lasting peace. Because basically the war has devastated every possible ways of coming to the discussion, to the table, to resolve political differences through dialogue. It has been exhausted. So let me talk about the Tigray war, and I'm not going to spend my time talking about the horrors of the war, the actors that participated in the war, or even project the consequences of the war. What I want to do is to put it in perspective in a way that my audience here could understand, and that is, until the outbreak of the Russo-Ukrainian war, the Tigray war was described as the largest conflict in the world. Now the Tigray war has taken a back seat to the Russian-Ukrainian war in terms of media attention and global concern. According to the Director General of the World Health Organization, the international community, this is a quotation, the international community has failed to give a fraction of attention to the people, in countries beyond Ukraine who are grappling with ripple effects of wars that are just as devastating. And he was referring to Syria, Afghanistan, and Yemen. Now, if the largest war is measured by the magnitude of attention, media attention, global media attention it receives, then the Russo-Ukrainian war is indeed the largest war. It commands the attention of the vast majority of the global population. What then is the meaning of the largest war as it applies to the Tigray war? Again, the WHO Director General characterizes the Tigray war as one of the longest and worst sieges by both Eritrean and Ethiopian forces in modern history. I would take modern history to mean the 20th century. And in terms of how long a siege had lasted in the wars of the 20th century, the longest siege in the world in the 20th century is the siege of Sarajevo, which lasted for about a total of 1,425 days. The next longest is the siege of Madrid, which besieged the population of the city for a total of 913 days. The third longest is the siege of Leningrad, which lasted, by my calculation, 869 days. Today, as I speak here, the Tigray siege is 521 days and it's climbing. This makes it the fourth. That's what I meant by giving you perspective, that it makes it the fourth longest siege of the 20th century, after Sarajevo, after Leningrad, and after Madrid. But notice one contrast here. Sarajevo, Madrid, and Leningrad are cities, major cities. Tigray is not a city, it's a whole region. So when we say the siege of Tigray, we're referring to major cities, towns, villages, hamlets, and homesteads. It's the whole region that is under siege. So in that sense, 521 days, it is not a siege of the city that could be compared with the other longest sieges in the world. It is the entire region. So in that sense, it is the first of its kind. Maybe in history, not even in contemporary history, but in history in general, that a region itself is under siege. It's the longest, but it's a different kind of the long siege. Another aspect of the WHO Director General's characterization is that it's also one of the worst. If a health official, so death itself is the major threat to health. That's the ultimate unhealth. So death is the ultimate threat. So from his perspective, when he says it's the worst, the Tigray war is indeed one of the worst in terms of the death toll that has occurred. Now, the most systematic study or estimate of the Tigray death toll is one that is compiled by a team of Professor Jan Neeson of the University of Ghent in Belgium, that he puts the number at 500,000. Now compare this with the Russia-Ukraine war that now commands global attention, 30,000. The Eritrea war of 1998, I'm taking examples from the neighborhood, is about 80,000, and that was considered one of the most devastating wars in the Horn of Africa. The Yemen Houthi conflict, 233,000, and the South Sudan war, civil war, 400,000. That makes the Tigray war one of the deadliest of the wars in recent years in the Horn of Africa, in terms of the sheer number. It is catastrophic enough that Tigray had suffered about 500,000 deaths in terms of death toll, but as a percentage of the pre-war population, the total loss of life in Tigray stands at 14% of the pre-war population. To put that perspective, let's compare it to the casualties of World War II, which is considered one of the most devastating war in the 20th century in terms of casualties. In the war, the Soviet Union lost an estimated 17 million people, and that is 15% of the pre-war population. Germany lost about 11%, and that about 9 million, that is 11% of the population. So Tigray is basically situated between the Soviet Union and Germany at 14%. So that really tells you how that the Tigray war is one of the deadliest, the most destructive in recent history. If I wanted to add one more dimension about the war itself, that the Tigray war is really a total war. And a total war is characterized by indescribable violence, aggression, distraction, and death. An important distinction of a total war is that it doesn't observe the rules of war. That's what a total war is. A total war, the Tigray war, has resulted in massive civilian or non-combatant suffering and death, because to prosecute the war, the Ethiopian National Defense Forces, 14 divisions that it had, all 14 divisions were sent into Tigray. That's about 112,000 people. The Eritrean 42 or 44 divisions of the Eritrean Defense Forces were also unleashed on Tigray. And numbers that I don't know of, one of the regions in the region, the Amhara region, also sent its police and special forces and paramilitary forces. About 3,000 people, soldiers also were deployed in this war from Somalia. And of course, the UAE with its drones, and afterwards Iran and Turkey were also assisting. So that much was unleashed against Tigray. So that is a total war. That's why we see lots of destruction, and only the human side of it is what I'm talking about. It's not the devastation in terms of infrastructure, schools, installations that are not necessary to achieve a military objective. Schools, universities, hospitals were destroyed. And there is no way that you could destroy a war and prosecute the war into it achieving its objectives. In that sense, Tigray war is the most destructive. So to sum it up, on the war side, the Tigray war is the largest, the deadliest, the most destructive war, and in terms of the siege of the whole region, the first of its kind. It is the biggest of the series of wars that are raging across Ethiopia, and understanding that violence and conceptualizing the deeper meaning of the war is critical to crafting a pathway to a durable and workable peace. So how should we understand? According to the Ethiopian government, the conflict in Tigray is a law enforcement operation designed to punish the TPLF, or the Tigray People's Liberation Front, the governing party in Tigray, for carrying out multiple sabotage around the country, holding elections without the permission of the central government, and attacking the Northern Command. But once the Tigray Defense Forces launched a blitzkrieg that liberated Tigray and evicted the Ethiopian and Eritrean defense forces out of Tigray and installed the elected government in Tigray, the war became a struggle to remove an existential threat against Ethiopia. Never mind that the Tigray people are also Ethiopians, but it's an existential threat that the Ethiopian government actually had to solicit support from Eritrea, from Somalia, from UAE, from everywhere, and to fight an existential threat in the country. Again, once the TDF trekked south and came to within 100 kilometers of the capital city, the war was re-Christianed again as an anti-imperialist pan-Africanist war waged against Ethiopia's historic enemies. And keep in mind that the historic enemies that the Ethiopian government is saying are all its own citizens. The fact that the government could not appropriately define the war that it had declared is indicative that the Tigray war is a purposeless, aimless, and meaningless war born in the mind of a megalomaniac obsessed with absolute power and now playing out in all corners of the country. It has no other meaning except that it is a purposeless, meaningless war waged against their own citizen simply to shore up and concentrate power in the hands of one autocrat. Now, that's the Ethiopian government. Other observers are saying this is a power struggle between the TPLF and the Ethiopian central government, that some others say that it is a struggle between those who are looking back in Tigray and those who are trying to move forward in Addis Ababa. But I don't want to bore you with that kind of discussion of how much that is true, but that is one characterization. And others are saying that it is an ideological division, and this is probably true to some extent, that it is a clash between a vision of a unitary state with an autocrat at the top of the pinnacle of power, and a vision of Ethiopia as a political community in which sovereignty is divided between the regional governments and the federal government. And that is the design of the constitution. Now, based on this characterizations and interpretations of what the meaning of the Tigray war is, one would assume that the restoration of the status quo ante would end the war and return to peace. And that is one pathway to peace. I don't think so. The proposition might have worked before the genocidal war in Tigray. After the genocide, a return to the way things were before the war would not end the peace and would not end the war and would not bring peace in the region. The other option, the existing option for the pathway to peace, is the Prosperity Party, the ruling party's national dialogue. The international community has put its face on the national dialogue as a viable pathway to peace. But is it a pathway to peace? I don't think so. The national dialogue as a conflict resolution method for post-conflict, deeply divided societies would have been an option in Ethiopia. An Ethiopia that is doubly deeply divided society before the war. After the genocide, it cannot be. It's a little, it's too late. It's a little too late and a little, what is that called? It's a little too late. That's what I wanted to say. Now, so what? And I will conclude with this. So what? First, let's reconceptualize the war. It's not what the government says. It's not what some observers say. I have elsewhere argued that the war, the Tigray war, showed that there is 3 monumental failures in Ethiopian politics. The failure of a national integration or state building, the failure of multinational federation as a way of governance, and the failure of democratization. 3 monumental failures. Let me elaborate a bit on this one. In the modern context, countries go through 3 stages to complete state building: territorial demarcation, legitimacy building, either through effectiveness or through elections, or democratization. If democratization succeeds, and there is a theory, a long-standing theory, political theory, that democracies don't fight. They resolve their differences through negotiations and addressing issues of social justice and participation. That had failed in Ethiopia, failed almost disastrously. An autocrat is in the establishment of authoritarian, autocratic, unitarist government is in place in Ethiopia. Now, historically, and this is true around the world, that centrifugal forces that seek equality and liberty are not responsible, or they do not cause the disintegration of a state. It is the centralizing unitarists who resort to violence, exclusion, marginalization, and repression in order to hang on to power that actually cause disintegration. Disintegration occurs in the middle, at the center, not in the periphery. So what would happen in Ethiopia now? 4 factors. Maybe for you, there are regional states in Ethiopia. As I said, the constitution divides sovereignty between the center and the regions. If you look at Tigray, and I don't want to take that much time talking about it, but if you look at Tigray, Tigray was attacked by the Ethiopian National Defense Forces. Genocide was conducted against them by the Ethiopian National Defense Forces. Now, for negotiations, the Ethiopian government puts as a precondition the disarming and the demobilization and the surrender of anyone suspected of committing crime to the Ethiopian government. Tigray cannot disarm. It was attacked by the ENDF and with the help of the Eritrean Defense Forces. You cannot disarm and hope that the very military forces that conducted genocide against you are going to protect you. What kind of anomalous relationship would they have? And because you don't, many of the people don't know this, the Somali region itself has never been integrated, or the residents were never made to feel like they are Ethiopians. They were also victims of the same kinds of atrocity crimes that were committed against Tigray. And in the case of Somali, it is not only this government, it is 4 successive governments that conducted genocide. They're not going to disarm, and they're not going to submit to the restoration of autocratic rule. The largest region is Oromia, and has endured the depredations of command post rule and economic stagnation for the last 4 years. They're not going to give up on their right to self-determination and self-rule. The Amhara region has been the incubator of all of the pathologies that have made Ethiopia, to use the characterization of the Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, describing the ailing Ottoman Empire. It is the Amhara region, and it is demands that actually made Ethiopia the sick man of the Horn of Africa. They are arming with the help of Eritreans. They are preparing for another round of war. So if you take these 4 regions, they are moving, drifting apart. They're not coming together, and there is going to be difficult to bring them together. So what should be done in terms of other pathway to peace? Internally, the core, the centrists, the unitarists have had their time for the last century. They have tried all kinds of ways to complete the state building. They have failed, and failed ignominiously, not once, but twice, before 1991 and now after 2018. They've had their time. If there is going to be a solution, it should come now from the periphery. Internally, if there is going to be a solution, the solution from within, it has to come from the periphery. And the periphery must be able to protect their inherent right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of self-determination. Then they can weave those values from the periphery into the center, but no solution from the center. Externally, I do not expect any collective response from the international community. It is hamstrung by the failure of its institutions. The African Union had endorsed the so-called law enforcement operations in Tigray. They are complicit. The Africa Union, its motto of Africa solution to African problems is in tatters, and its architecture of peace and security has fallen into disuse forever. That's not a candidate for external solution. The United Nations has now reverted back to its stasis of the Cold War days. Every time the Security Council gathered to discuss Tigray, any initiative had been vetoed by Russia and China. It's always been net from Russia. It's always been do from China. So it's gone back to the Cold War days, and I do not expect any solution coming from the international community. This leaves Western governments. I think the Biden administration, they have addressed the issue a number of times in the right way. They have also done the right thing, but they do not have the capacity as just one country to resolve the problem, and they have other problems in their hands. But if the United States provides leadership, as it did when Yugoslavia was collapsing in the early 1990s, the rest of Western governments would follow. They would follow. So what I wanted to suggest was that after the Holocaust and after Rwanda, the international community must fear that the genocidal rhetoric of Ethiopian officials could become a reality in Ethiopia. They're preparing for that. So the see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil approach is not going to resolve the issue. They must engage the international community in the Dayton type peace process to save a catastrophic violent demise of the old Ethiopian empire. Internally, solutions can come from only the periphery. Externally, only Western governments with an approach I just said that they used to bring the warring parties together as Yugoslavia was disintegrating in the 1990s. Those are the two things that could bring about the end of violence, the end of war. I'm not sure that that simply means that it is the pathway to peace, but it could end violence. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Gebissa, for that insightful talk. He discussed pathways to peace in Ethiopia. So our next presenter has had a very long day, a lot of cancellations of flights, delayed flights. She'll be explaining to us the background of the Tigray conflict, what is happening in Tigray, why are we here, and why this discussion is so important. Her name is Meaza Gebremedhin. She's an international relations researcher, a human rights advocate, and a community organizer with the group Tigray, a nonpartisan global organization that advocates for Tigrayans and other marginalized groups. So let's give a warm welcome for her while she comes up.
Thank you, Alula. Good evening, everyone. My name is Meaza. Professor Ezekiel did an amazing job in giving you the very academic aspect of what's happening, the state building, the reasons behind it. I will dive deeper into the Tigray genocide and what has been happening since November 4th of 2020. Tigray is a region on the northernmost part of Ethiopia. Geographically, in terms of size, it's very small, but historically, it's a very important part of Ethiopia. Almost everything you know about Ethiopia originates in Tigray. The fact that Ethiopia has been home to religious groups that coexisted peacefully for over 300 years, the fact that Muslim and Christians live together, the fact that in Ethiopia you find Black people that have successfully defeated white colonizers. You find that history in Tigray at the Battle of Adwa. The first African mosque is located in Tigray. It's called Al-Najashi. Some Muslim or Islam scholars credit existence of Islam today to the Christian king that gave refugee to survivors of Muhammad in Tigray. Tigray is also home to the Ark of the Covenant in Christianity. This Ark of Covenant holds really great importance. Tigray is also home to one of the most hardworking group of people. In terms of number, we're small, but as I said, there has been multiple attempts at exterminating the people of Tigray historically, because Tigray carries a lot of importance in the history of Ethiopia. There has been a lot of attempts, particularly by Amhara extremists, to erase the people of Tigray and claim their history and claim their bravery. Fast tracking to November 4th of 2020, when the world was completely occupied anticipating what the presidential election will be in the US, the Ethiopian government colluded with the Eritrean government, a government that has been known to be a force of destabilization and chaos in the Horn of Africa for so many years. They colluded together and waged a genocidal war against the people of Tigray. In order to effectively hide the magnitude and the type of war crimes against humanity and genocide that are being committed against the people of Tigray, the Ethiopian government successfully isolated Tigray from the rest of the world. There are no phones, there is no internet. You cannot pick up the phone and check on your mom or on your relatives in Tigray. So for the past almost 18 months now, allied forces of the Ethiopian government, the Eritrean government, as well as local extremist groups from the Amhara region have been committing some of the worst human rights violations in the history of human beings. Rape and other types of sexual violence are being used as a war tactic. According to reports from the Tigray government and from the Tigray Health Bureau, over 120,000 young girls and women have been gang raped. While they rape them, we have heard personal testimony of survivors that the rapists were telling them that they were doing it in order to cleanse their bloodline, in order to ensure the Tigrayan womb doesn't continue to give birth. So the intent of exterminating the people of Tigray is reflected in the things they say as they commit these genocidal crimes. In addition to rape, starvation is also being used as a war tactic. Historians and history enthusiasts know how during the Nazi era, hunger plan was effectively used by the German Nazi to weaken any resistance against their plan. The same thing is happening in Ethiopia. The Ethiopian government very well understands that the only way they can effectively subjugate the people of Tigray is if they starve them to death. And that's exactly what they're doing. Since the conflict began, there hasn't been any sustainable flow of humanitarian aid to Tigray. And this is happening while the Ethiopian troops, Amhara militia, as well as Eritrean troops have effectively destroyed crops, looted resources. Farmers and civilians are left with nothing to feed their children with. Mothers in Tigray are having to choose whether to kill themselves first so that they don't see their children die to death, or to feed them leaves and other plants that are normally not edible. Over 80% of the health facility in Tigray has completely collapsed. It has completely been destroyed. Because as I said earlier, the ultimate objective of this war, it's not only political. The intent is to erase Tigray. And the one way they see achieving this goal is weakening Tigray as a community, weakening Tigray as a region. And to weaken Ethiopia, to weaken Tigray, they're effectively destroying the public infrastructure and gains of development that the people have worked so hard for in the past 30 plus years. So all hospitals have been destroyed. There is only one hospital that is now trying to provide basic care for civilians. It's in the capital city of Tigray, Mekelle. But even that hospital, prior to the beginning of the conflict, was among the biggest medical centers that give training and service not only to Tigrayans, but also to Ethiopians and other Africans who would come to Tigray to learn. It was one of the biggest hospitals to teach for research purposes and also to provide service. That hospital now has become a center just to count number of days. doctors and clinicians do not have enough equipment and supplies to treat people with. So because of that, doctors are just sitting there counting the number of people that they're unable to save because everything they could use to save has been looted and destroyed. And in addition to this, Tigrayans that used to live and continue to live in different parts of Ethiopia, other than Tigray, have been ethnically profiled. They have been subjected, they have been harassed. Their assets has been taken away from them by the government and by vigilante groups across the country. And over 70,000 of them are now languishing in concentration camps that are similar to the concentration camps we all read in history during the Nazi era. In these concentration camps, Tigrayans are abused. They don't have access to food. They don't have access to basic needs such as toilets. If they ask for the services, they are met with brutality and with massacre. Ethiopian heroic, Tigrayan heroic members of the former Ethiopian National Army who served Ethiopia bravely for so many years have been detained, and they continue to be massacred and assassinated while in concentration camps. Just 2 days ago, one of the brave Ethiopian generals who comes from Tigray, after languishing in prison for 17 months, he was assassinated. And all of this is happening at the backdrop of an international community not taking a firm stand against a regime that continues to weaponize starvation, sexual violence in order to achieve political gain. The international community continues to give chance after chance to the Ethiopian dictator because they're putting political interests above and beyond human lives. You see a lot of international actors, including the World Food Programme, linking political issues with humanitarian aid. All of us know that no matter how bad a conflict is, people have the right to have access to food and to medicine. In Ethiopia, food is being used as a bargaining chip. Tigrayans are literally being told either to back down and to give up their constitutional and democratic right, self-determination, or die through starvation. And all of this might seem so foreign to you all, but you can only imagine the burden that the Tigrayan diaspora had to carry for the past 18 months. Almost everyone you see here today who is from the Tigray community haven't heard anything from their family members. We do not know if our mothers, fathers are alive, but we see pictures of very fragile people from Tigray on TVs, and we wonder if those are one of our family members. We hear stories of Tigrayans being massacred in group. We hear stories of young girls being gang raped as young as 4 years old. And we hear mothers being gang raped, and after they rape them, filling their private parts with foreign objects such as dirt, condom, and others, in order to make sure they inflict a lasting pain on them. So you wonder if this is your mom, if this is your sister, but we cannot give up. So we continue to advocate, we continue to raise the alarm so that the international community could do what is expected from it, not only to save lives in Tigray, but also to set a precedent that sends a strong message to other dictatorial regimes in the world that they cannot exterminate their people with impunity. But unfortunately, because we're small in number back home, even more here, our voices haven't been heard. We hear the US government, particularly the State Department, talking about maintaining Ethiopia's territorial integrity. A country's territorial integrity cannot be maintained forcefully. People should have the willing and the interest to remain within that particular country. But what's even more ironic is that the people of Tigray have always been a #1 proponent of Ethiopia. They have paid ultimate price to keep Ethiopia intact, to make sure that there is a booming economy in the country for so many years. If you ever come across a Tigrayan not wanting to identify as an Ethiopian anymore. It's because of the level of pain that has been inflicted upon us. This is not a secessionist movement, as so many are trying to present it such. This is a struggle for survival. Human beings are literally fighting tooth and nail to be alive, to have access to food, to medicine, to water, not to be raped in public, not to be massacred, not for their properties to be taken away from them just because they're Tigrayans. So there is a lot of education that is needed to happen, but there is also so much power in our hands if all of us come together collectively, and if we force politicians to do right by the civilians that are languishing in the dark, we can make a difference. Just last month on March 24th, there was a humanitarian truce that was declared and agreed upon by both parties to the conflict. And there was so much hope from the international community. We hope that Tigrayans would finally have access to humanitarian aid. But that was used only to revamp the Ethiopian government's image within the diplomatic corps. There hasn't been any meaningful aid that reached to Tigray. According to reports from the UN, over 100 trucks loaded with humanitarian aid are needed to reach to Tigray on a daily basis to meet the basic needs. Since the declaration of that humanitarian truce, only less than 200 trucks have made it to Tigray. This is nothing compared to the staggering need on the ground. But we don't see international actors talking about what is lacking. Why the Ethiopian government continues to gamble with the lives of innocent people. Because there is this notion of maintaining the territorial integrity of Ethiopia at the expense of over 6 million people starving to death. And for everyone here, peace can only be achieved if people's voices, if people's questions are answered. You cannot suppress a popular movement. You cannot suppress people's questions and force them to live peacefully. You have to answer their questions. And the people of Tigray have only one question, and that is for their right self-determination to be respected. So the US government, particularly since we're in the US, it's important to narrow it down. The US government needs to assess the situation on the ground and fulfill its responsibility to protect. There has been multiple warnings that were given by the State Department, particularly to the Amhara forces that continue to illegally annex and occupy parts of Tigray, particularly the western parts of Tigray, and alongside the Eritrean troops. They have been requested to withdraw, but there wasn't any consequence. All these promises and concerns that have been provided by the State Department are just falling on deaf ears because there is no effective mechanism to ensure these demands are met. So if Eritrean troops are to leave Tigray, if Amhara forces are to withdraw from the parts of Tigray that they have illegally annexed, there has to be a punitive measure on the table. The State Department continues to believe that they can use only the carrots. But in diplomacy, we all know that the carrot is only effective if you use the stick effectively as well. The Ethiopian government, alongside its allies for the past 18 months, have clearly showed us that the only language it understands is punitive measures and not necessarily diplomacy. So if there is indeed a desire to uphold the promise of never again, the US government needs to change its approach towards Ethiopia, hold the Ethiopian government and its cronies accountable, and make sure lives do not continue to perish in the dark. And I'm not sure if Professor Ezekiel has mentioned this, but there are so many actors in this conflict. The people of Tigray are not only being exterminated by Ethiopians as well as Eritreans. Russia is involved, China is involved, Turkey, United Arab Emirates, and so many other countries. Countries that do not necessarily uphold human rights. So if the US government is concerned about Russia's involvement in Ukraine, they should also be equally alarmed by Russia's involvement in Tigray. The genocide has been going on for the past 18 months. We all have seen how the US government has rallied its allies to be there for the people in Ukraine within a blink of an eye. That is it's a remarkable thing to do. That should be the answer to every conflict, not only to conflicts that carry more political and economic interests to us. I think international relations, when we all study about it, it puts humanity at the center, or at least it's supposed to center human beings and human lives and human rights, not necessarily political and economic interests. But what has been proven to us time and again throughout this Tigray genocide is that our lives do not matter. Not only because we're Black, but also because there seems to be no real political and economic interest that forces political actors in the international community to move with the speed they need in order to save lives. But I think we can all make change. We can all make a difference. We can shift this way of thinking. And we do that by engaging our local politicians, by engaging policymakers, by engaging academicians, by making sure that we provide platforms to those suppressed, to those who do not have the state apparatus to push their agenda. I'm aware this event was supposed to happen last week with the backing of the university. But after the university got a wave of emails from genocide apologists, it got canceled. Instead of researching, instead of asking questions and trying to understand what are the real issues behind this genocide, I was very dismayed that the faculty decided to cancel it altogether. I think universities and academic institutions have a responsibility to make sure that their students and faculty have access to real information. So canceling that event by itself is sustaining the genocide. It is sustaining the suffering of innocent people. And I hope the university, after this event, would make the corrective action and host another event so that a bigger audience could have access to the information and hear the plight of the innocent people of Tigray that have been undergoing a state-sponsored genocide for over 18 months now. I'll leave you with some numbers. In Tigray today, over 5.2 million people are in need of emergency humanitarian aid. Over 900,000 are in famine-like conditions. Over 500,000 innocent Tigrayans have been killed, some due to the man-made famine, some due to lack of medication, some during the conflict. In Tigray today, as I said, 100 trucks are needed on a daily basis to meet the basic needs of the people. But there is no any access whatsoever on the ground. And there has to be unrestricted and unfettered humanitarian corridor to Tigray through land so that aid agencies could rally their resources and be there for the people. The US aid is one of the biggest donors to Ethiopia. They give the most donation to Ethiopia than any other country in the world. But they haven't been able to access Tigray as much as they should. This conflict has impacted other regions as well, neighboring regions, Amhara and Afar. But all international aid workers and humanitarian organizations have full access to these regions. So people in need are actually getting medicine and food, unlike those in Tigray. This clearly shows you how the Ethiopian government is using starvation as a war tactic. So there cannot be double standard. There cannot be two approaches to the same problem. If the world is truly concerned about peace and bringing about stability to the Horn of Africa, then they should hold the Ethiopian government accountable alongside the Eritrean government that continues to cause flares of conflict, not only in Tigray, not only in Ethiopia, but also in South Sudan, in Kenya, Djibouti, and elsewhere. The problem is so bad that the Sudan government, for the first time in the history of UN, had to request contingent members of the UN peacekeeping that were in Sudan maintaining peace to leave its territory. In the wake of a border conflict between Sudan and Ethiopia, the Sudan government decided that they don't trust Ethiopians to maintain peace, although they are members of the UN peacekeeping. So they have requested that they be replaced by other people from a different country. This has never, ever happened within the history of UN. This is so significant. It shows the true nature of the Ethiopian government. And following this development, over 500 Tigray members of the Ethiopian peacekeeping forces have sought asylum and are currently in Sudan. And at the beginning of the war, because there was a way out, escape or to flee the war zone, around 70,000 civilians have made the agonizing journey and they made it to Sudan. They're living as refugees there in different camps, but even their needs are not met. These are the refugees that provide us with a glimpse of what has happened in Tigray. Because as I said, there is no access to Tigray. Journalists are not allowed to get in there. There are no phones, so you cannot have real information. But through this survivors, through this refugees, we learned that rape has been used and continue to be used as a war tactic, the same as famine. Chemical weapons have been used. Drones sponsored by United Arab Emirates, Russia, China, and other countries have been used to destroy not military facilities, but civil infrastructure, universities, hospitals, church, mosque. So what's happening to the people of Tigray is it should really shake our humanity, because the level of atrocities that are being committed are unheard of. And according to scholars, the worst humanitarian crisis in the world right now is not in Ukraine, it's in Tigray. But as I said earlier, for so many different factors, the Tigray crisis is not getting as much attention as it should. And I worry not only for the people of Tigray, but for the precedent the world is setting for other authoritarian regimes across the globe. If the international community doesn't take a bold stand today and in the Tigray genocide, what moral ground would it have to stop another dictatorial regime from doing the same thing? The Tigray people have been advocating for an independent and international investigation led by the UN so that war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the genocide that has been committed against the people of Tigray could get a chance at getting justice. And after so much effort, the UN has finally established a special inquiry commission. But guess what? The Ethiopian government doesn't accept this. The Tigray government has made it clear from the very beginning that they're willing to cooperate and work with international investigation teams to ensure that civil rights have been maintained across the war. But because Ethiopia very well knows the level and magnitude of crimes that its troops and its crimes have committed, they're rejecting this call. But as Tigrayans and as advocates of human rights, what we're calling for is an immediate cessation of hostilities, unfettered and unrestricted humanitarian corridor to Tigray, and an inclusive national dialogue so that political differences could be solved through dialogue and discussions rather than war bullets. These are simple questions that should be supported by anybody, but except that the Ethiopian government doesn't have any interest in finding a political solution to the conflict, it continues to ignore these calls and find ways to deceive the international community into sustaining the Tigray genocide. So I urge you all to use the information you have received today and to do a bit more research. You can go to omnatigray.org. That's a nonprofit organization that focuses on educated advocacy. You can find other tools and more information that would help you to understand better and find ways to effectively advocate for innocent people that are at the receiving end of a state-sponsored genocide. Because if we don't do that today, it's only a matter of time before the entire population of Tigray is exterminated. And there will be time in history where we will be asked, what did you do? What did you do when innocent, helpless people were facing a state-sponsored genocide? At least if we do our best, we would say, I wasn't an accomplice. I didn't sustain the suffering of innocent people. I have done my fair share of the job. So I hope you all will use this information to do that and to clear yourself from a mental liability and accountability. Because if you and I don't come together and say enough is enough, politicians would always find ways to justify the suffering of innocent people. We have seen it happening everywhere. But this should be really an opportunity for us to truly walk the talk and say never again in action. So there are protests being organized everywhere across the US. If you go to Tigray, you will find information about them and you will join them. But as students, I kindly urge you to share this information with your classmates, with your members of faculty if you're an educator, and make sure everyone is aware of what's happening. Because genocide shouldn't be left to be fought by those at the receiving end of it. It is a universal crime that should be fought by everybody in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Meaza, for that powerful talk, discussing the deadliest conflict in the world that's receiving little to no attention at all, which really shows the importance of this and why we have to say never again, and we really have to live by that. Next, moving forward, we've discussed pathways to peace. We've discussed the background to this conflict, what's happening, the deadly atrocities that are occurring. Now we'll move on to obstacles of peace. So what has taken so long to stop this deadly conflict, and what are the real obstacles that we are encountering? So we'll have William Davison give us that talk. William is a senior Ethiopia analyst for the International Crisis Group. He was Bloomberg's Ethiopia correspondent, has also published in The Guardian, Foreign Policy, Al Jazeera, and other international medias. Really grateful to William for joining us today, as he's in East Africa. It's extremely late over there, almost 3 a.m., but he was grateful to join, and we're really grateful to him. So with that, I'll leave the stage to William and give you your time.
Thank you very much. Yes, I think the previous speakers have clearly outlined the suffering in Tigray that this war has entailed. And in terms of the obstacles to peace, I think a little bit of context about the political situation that frames the war is necessary. I'll try and be very brief about this. In 2020, Ethiopia was going to conduct a national election. That was postponed due to the pandemic, and the federal government ruled to extend all government terms, including Tigray's governments, beyond their constitutional mandates. There's lots of politics behind this, but essentially Tigray's government defiantly said that this was not acceptable, partly speaking to the autonomy that regional states are invested in, that Ezekiel referred to. And they said, we are going to go ahead and run a regional election regardless, because our regional government cannot overstay its constitutional mandate. The federal government objected to that. And again, there's a lot of politics in between, but these are the essential circumstances that led to the outbreak of war in November 2020. And it was a war between the Ethiopian federal government and one of its regional governments, the Tigray regional government. Again, as explained by Ezekiel and also Meaza, this involved a full frontal assault on Tigray from November 2020, and the war since then has been quite dynamic. Initially, Tigray's government was removed from power, and then its leaders mounted a rebellion in the first half of 2021, or I should say a resistance, and that led to the end of the federal occupation of Tigray in the middle of last year. Subsequent to that, because of the partly because of the siege policies that were being implemented by the federal government and its allies, the Tigray forces went on the offensive in the second half of 2021, even to the extent of threatening to remove the federal government from power. That didn't come to pass, and instead we saw the Tigray forces, after a relatively successful offensive in military terms, they retreated back to Tigray at the end of last year. The situation we have now is essentially the same phase of the war has begun after the Tigray forces retreated to their own region. The federal government is allowing some aid to trickle into Tigray, but the region is still disconnected from the national economy. There is no normal trade. The federally provided services, banking, telecommunications, power, are not being provided. And also there is very insufficient aid for a very needy population. But the Tigray government and its people have shown the way that they responded to the federal attempts to enforce their rule in the region. They have shown their ability not just to defend Tigray and eject the federal forces, but also to go on the offensive. So the question now is, how do we achieve some sort of political solution, or maybe just a political process to try and avoid a continuation of the suffering that you've heard Ezekiel and Meaza describe. I think contained in their presentations are some of the problems that we face. First of all, the Tigray people believe that they are suffering a genocidal attack from the federal government. That means that any solution that's provided by the Ethiopian government is not one that the Tigray people or its leaders are likely to accept, because they believe that that is a genocidal force that is lined up against them. From the federal government's perspective, the Tigray region, the Tigray government, the Tigray people have responded by building up a significantly sized and capable military force that has already shown its teeth, so to speak, and has indeed even threatened power at Addis Ababa. So we have a constitutional electoral dispute, a political dispute, and we are embroiled in a civil war where there is not just mistrust between the parties, but there is also forces that have been engaged in a brutal civil war for getting on for 18 months. These are not the only complications that we are presented with. I think it is important to note that, as Ezekiel stated, it is very unlikely that Tigray's government is willing to disarm in the way that the federal government is suggesting. Therefore, how can we achieve peace whilst we have these forces lined up against each other? Another critical aspect of the conflict is territorial. You will have heard Ezekiel refer to Amhara region and the ambitions and ideology he described during this war that has resulted in Amhara region effectively annexing a part of Tigray regional state in the west, and Amhara forces remain, and Amhara administrators remain in control of Western Tigray, and that is not something that is accepted by Tigray's leaders. That is a position that is backed up by Eritrea's government, which has positions in the north of Western Tigray, and also to some extent by the federal government. If we were to see a solution to this issue, where Amhara region is in control of this territory, but Tigray's government understandably claims it as its own, as something which was part of Tigray throughout the federal era since 1995, then we would expect some form of federal intervention or perhaps some form of international intervention to resolve the problem. But as described, the federal government is not considered anything like a neutral actor by Tigray's government as one of the genocidal forces lined up against it. We are therefore embroiled not just in a brutal civil war, which is ongoing, but one where the political circumstances that led to the civil war remain. And even though we have things like a humanitarian truce announced in March, yes, we have a trickle of aid, but also that does nothing to address those political problems that lie at the root of this dispute and all of the violence and suffering that you have heard of. This takes us, I think, to the international response to the conflict. Whilst the various international actors have, I believe, adopted principled positions in terms of calling for unfettered humanitarian access, a ceasefire, and political negotiations to resolve Ethiopia's dispute, as will be obvious by now, this has proved ineffective. I think if we look at the international system, we can perhaps understand why that is. The ability to enforce those types of policies, unfettered humanitarian access, ceasefire, political dialogue, is something which is generally reserved the United Nations Security Council. As referred to, there has not been support from some of the permanent members of the United Security Council for any kind of enforcement, any types of assertive action with regards to this conflict. There are many reasons for that, but essentially we can say that whilst we have heard an exposition of the Tigray narrative and the Tigray cause this evening, there are also actors in the international system who side with Abiy Ahmed's federal government. They believe that maybe these claims of, they definitely believe these claims of allegations of genocide are not legitimate. They do believe that Abiy's federal government is the legitimate power in Ethiopia, and that has led them to not take the sort of stances that would support the type of enforcement mechanisms that are needed to resolve this dispute. So instead, we are left with the US, the European Union, like-minded nations, attempting to influence the situation, attempting to improve humanitarian access, urging the parties, coaxing the parties towards, particularly the federal government, towards the type of action that they want to see. We have seen some punitive measures, the establishment of a sanctions regime, the withholding of some development assistance, particularly budget support for the federal government, but nothing that has really influenced the situation in a significant way. The problem for everyone, therefore, is how to change these calculations. At the moment, there is really nothing to suggest in the Ethiopian internal political dynamics, in the Horn of Africa regional dynamics, in the African continental picture, or coming from the international system that suggests that they have a mechanism, the political will to really assert themselves to correct the situation, to end the suffering, to move Ethiopia off the path of violence. As things stand, there is no immediate solution to the problem. I think if we are looking at progressive and somewhat practical approaches, we need to see a greater recognition from the US, European Union, and like-minded nations that these piecemeal efforts, these piecemeal steps towards addressing the situation are insufficient. What we have in Tigray and in Ethiopia is a continuation of a blockade or a siege strategy. The federal government is denying basic services to Tigray in the form of banking, telecommunications, and power. It is only allowing a trickle of aid through. This is threatening the lives of hundreds of thousands of people, and that is unacceptable behavior. It is a violation of international humanitarian law. Realistically, we are not going to see concerted, unanimous action from the UN Security Council to address this problem. But realistically and practically, we could see a greater recognition that, especially in the context of the humanitarian truce and the pledges by the federal government to address the humanitarian situation inside Tigray, we could see a restoration of services, a reconnection of Tigray to the national economy and the provision of truly unfettered humanitarian access to address the suffering inside Tigray. Now, that would not solve Ethiopia's political problems, but it would be a belated sign of good faith and good intentions from the federal government that despite those political problems, they are willing to do all they can to address the human suffering inside Tigray and perhaps act as some sort of building block towards a negotiated ceasefire and the beginning of sincere and comprehensive and inclusive political discussions to address some of the problems that lie at the root of this conflict. I will leave it there because I want to give as much time as possible to Kindeya and also Dr. Kindeya and also for questions, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Davison, for that enlightening talk. Now we will be introducing Dr. Kindeya Gebrehiwot, who was the former president of Mekelle University and represents Tigray External Affairs Office. So I would like to start with the first question, Dr. Gebrehiwot. Have peaceful negotiations between the Tigray regional government and the Ethiopian federal government been initiated to ensure the delivery of humanitarian aid, and how successful have these negotiations been between the two governments?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to this August gathering on violence and famine in Tigray. The previous speakers have described what's happening in Tigray, and I think I couldn't agree more. And perhaps just to respond to your question, first of all, the Abiy regime and its domestic and foreign allies have legal obligations under international humanitarian law to provide unfettered humanitarian access to civilians in the context of armed conflict. This was also been explained by the previous speakers. The government of Tigray is of the firm belief that, in principle, humanitarian issues must be decoupled from political issues. Humanitarian aid provision is not dependent on the emotional makeup or the daily mood swings of the belligerents. It's to be provided by all parties pursuant to their obligations under international law, as was described earlier. Having said that, there were talks between the two sides on mechanisms for facilitating humanitarian aid provisions to Tigray. Those talks, however, for reasons clear to itself alone, the Abiy regime declared what it called a unilateral humanitarian truce to facilitate aid delivery to Tigray. The government of Tigray, for its part, has taken a number of affirmative steps, such effecting a complete withdrawal from Afar as a gesture of goodwill and commitment to finding a peaceful way out of the current impasse. As you know, you cannot put a preconditions for humanitarian access. Sadly, the Abiy regime in Addis is much more adept at making empty promises to deflect international pressures and hoodwink the international community into thinking that it's playing by the rules than delivering on those promises. As you know, most of this international community have been sending congratulatory messages for every 20 or 30 aid trucks reaching to Tigray, which is very sad. In the month of April, when the so-called humanitarian truce has been in effect, only less than 200 aid trucks arrived, as Meaza was explaining, representing a mere 5% of the aid required during this period. So the humanitarian situation already is catastrophic and is getting worse by each day, and people are dying. And this is how I would like to respond to your first question. Thank you.
Okay. So the international community has obviously played a huge role in the ongoing crisis in the Tigray region. What has been done to alleviate the situation on their part? And has there been any strong actions taken by the international community to ensure that humanitarian aid reaches Tigray?
Well, I think this was also being mentioned by speakers. The international community has been airing concerns, and especially in the UN Security Council, there have been a number of attempts, but very sad that there were also countries that been blocking any further action. The international community has failed Tigray in two senses. In one sense, it has failed by ignoring its pre-war pleas for preventive diplomacy to starve of a genocidal war for being unleashed against Tigray. This was also well explained by Professor Ezekiel, that the war, when it broke in November 2020, could have been done earlier to stop this nonsense war. Tens of thousands of Tigrayans have been killed. Hundreds of thousands of Tigrayans have been forcibly displaced from their homes. In Western Tigray, which is now annexed by the Amhara region and the Eritrean government, a systematic campaign of ethnic cleansing has been perpetrated against Tigrayans as the expansionist Amhara forces seek to change the demographic makeup of Western Tigray so that they can justify and legitimize their illegal annexation of a constitutionally recognized Tigrayan territory. Our enemies have also deliberately destroyed Tigray's economy and its service providing infrastructure. The international community, despite being fully aware of these facts, has done little to prevent further atrocities from being committed. The international community, fortunately, has not taken meaningful pressures towards forcing the regime to facilitate unfettered humanitarian access to Tigray. As I've mentioned earlier, the international community is busy in counting trucks that have reached Tigray, not on the unfettered humanitarian access. Despite being aware of the fact that the Abiy regime and its allies have been willfully obstructing humanitarian aid delivery to Tigray, the international community generally and some powerful countries in particular have not gone beyond statements of concern, as I mentioned earlier. Thank you.
So Western Tigray is still being occupied by Ethiopian and Eritrean forces. There have been reports of ethnic cleansing and ongoing massacres. And do you foresee a future in which the Ethiopian and Eritrean governments will withdraw their forces for a successful ceasefire?
Well, this was one of the red lines that we've been mentioning, that the territorial integrity of Tigray should be maintained. But the expansionist Amhara regional government has illegally annexed Western Tigray, a constitutionally recognized Tigrayan territory. The dictatorial Isaias of the Eritrean regime provides military support to the annexing region. Isaias has been cultivating parallel subnational ties with Ethiopia independently of the federal government. As a result, Eritrea's influence in Ethiopia has intensified, absent of robust international pressures to isolate Eritrea and raise the costs of its destabilizing activity in Ethiopia. Amhara forces and the Eritrean army will still continue their illegal presence. If the international community refuses to compel these forces to withdraw from Western Tigray, the people of Tigray will have no option other than to use force to liberate themselves from these genocidal powers.
So reports have been circulating that the Eritrean government is preparing to reinvade Tigray a second time. What was the aftermath of Eritrea's first invasion of Tigray? And what would be the ramifications of a second invasion by Eritrea on the Tigrayan people?
Well, I think it's not only reports. As we speak, the Eritrean forces shell the different territories of Tigray almost every day. Well, in the first phase of Abiy's genocidal war on Tigray, the Eritrean army participated fully with all its full capabilities as was explained by Professor Ezekiel. It has committed and continued to commit some of the most flagrant violations of international humanitarian law and international humanitarian rights law. It occupies Western Tigray, assisting the expansionist Amhara region consolidate its illegal annexation, and beyond Western Tigray, it's also occupying Tigrayan territories in northwestern Tigray, central and eastern Tigray, and still is committing vicious atrocities in those areas with impunity. The Eritrean army has fully taken part in ethnic cleansing against Tigrayans in Western Tigray. It has used sexual violence and hunger as a tool of war. It has decimated Tigray's economy. It has looted private and public wealth. It's now busy impending efforts to bring about peace for its thrives on turmoil, and peace is an essential threat to the region. So if Eritrea invades Tigray, the consequence will be even more brutal. It will also accelerate the irrevocable collapse of the Ethiopian state.
Okay, Dr. Gebrehiwot, thank you so much. That was our last question for you. I'd like to remind the Zoom audience, if you guys have any questions, please drop it in the chat. Panelists, feel free to answer those questions. So what can UB students do to create change with this conflict and reach lawmakers?
Sorry. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I think students are some of the most influential actors in social change. We have seen it historically during the Darfur conflict, for example. It's university students and high school students that actually made sure the plights of the Sudanese people were heard properly. So in this particular case, the university students, one, educate yourself. As I said earlier, information is power in today's world. So I would urge you to learn more about the nature of the genocide that's happening, the systemic way of deception the Ethiopian government is utilizing, and how the international community has been very reluctant to take meaningful actions. So once you educate yourself, become an ally, participate in protests, organize panel discussions, spread the word amongst your friends and network, and also talk to your local political representatives. At the end of the day, it's the policymakers that can act on the sanction regime that has been established for over a year now. The Biden administration has put in place a sanction regime that stipulates specific economic and diplomatic sanctions to be taken against parties to this genocide if humanitarian corridor is not to be provided to the people, if cessation of hostilities is not going to be intact, and so many other requirements. But it is high time that the Biden administration acts on its promises and, one, recognize the Tigray genocide, two, take punitive measures against these flagrant actors, because so far the only sanction that has been put in place is a flight restriction on some actors. And even the names of those actors who are not supposed to be flying into US is not disclosed. Members of the Ethiopian government continues to come to the US and pursue their genocidal agenda, having meetings with policymakers left and right. So the university students can really change the course of action here by becoming an active advocate for peace and stability. As I said earlier, this is not a matter of saving Tigrayans. This is a matter of upholding our responsibility to protect helpless people collectively. So I think the specific action items are to educate yourself further, to become an ally, participate in panel discussions, organize events, and use your social media effectively too.
So just a follow-up question. We'll keep it with Meaza. That's on a similar topic. Someone asked, dying from hunger, they say, is more torturous and agonizing than being beheaded or other ways of dying. Do you think the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Tigrayans is any different from the Holocaust, which killed millions of Jews, other than the overall magnitude of these conflicts?
Thank you for that question. And in answering this, the intent isn't to minimize the pain that has been inflicted during the Holocaust. It's only to show how staggering the pain of the people of Tigray is. And I don't think that's different. It's exactly the same, might even be worse, because we're at a time where everything could be easily stopped. We're at a time where information could be shared amongst influential actors, and we can mobilize ourselves. I feel like the world is more equipped with, mechanisms that can help end the suffering of innocent life. But because there is no political will, something worse than the Holocaust is happening to the innocent people of Tigray today. So yes, the pain that is being inflicted upon the people of Tigray is the same as what happened during the Holocaust, except that there are different manifestations, different ways that it's being manifesting itself.
And do a few more questions. This one we'll ask to William. I think you touched on this a little bit, but follow-up question someone has is, why is the international community so hesitant to take action on what has been categorized as one of the deadliest conflicts in the world?
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think it's the sort of practicalities of it that's the problem. As I tried to describe, and as Ezekiel talked about, we don't have anything like a consensus at the UNSC. That is obviously the mandated international body to try and intervene in this type of circumstance. So it is that lack of agreement amongst the international community that's hindering the type of response that you're referring to. That will leave us with, more sort of independent actions by nation states. The US obviously is dominant and influential in this area. It has been actively involved in diplomacy and mediation, trying to improve humanitarian access. It has established a sanctions regime, but it hasn't yet taken the sort of steps that are needed to really try and influence the situation in this regard. Obviously, there are other considerations in Ethiopia. The country overall is in a very fragile state. By far, the worst conflict has been centered around Tigray. We also have a raging conflict in Oromia, which Professor Ezekiel could tell you all about if we had the time. There was also a recent flare-up of religious tensions. We have a very serious economic situation. We have 25 million Ethiopians out of a population of 110, which are in need of some form of emergency assistance. So there are overall concerns about the fragility of Ethiopia. Therefore, action against the federal government as a coercive measure to try and get the federal government to do the right thing with regards to Tigray. There are concerns from international policy makers that would lead to the overall weakening of Ethiopia if we have an increasingly incapable federal government in this circumstance, and that could lead to suffering across the country. It is these types of concerns that's leading to this position. Although, obviously the presenters tonight have described the situation with a genocidal campaign against one region. Other actors in the international community, they view the situation differently. Some of them consider the action by the federal government, certainly initially, to be legitimate in terms of action by a federal government against a defiant regional state. So there is, a lack of moral clarity, a lack of decisiveness collectively in the international community about what should be done here. When you combine that with the dysfunction at the UNSC and the disagreement there, and the concerns about Ethiopia's overall stability, that's what leads to this sort of inaction. And as I tried to state in my presentation, I think the way that this should be approached when we look at it pragmatically, but with regards to the suffering, is the humanitarian issue should be prioritized. Tigray is disconnected from the national economy. It is effectively under blockade. The federally provided services, banking, telecommunications, and power, as well as trade and aid, they are being denied by the federal government. And I think it is there that the US and like-minded nations, they need to focus their energies on trying at least to get the federal government to reverse that policy and try and prioritize the suffering of people in Tigray and deal with the politics of this war separately.
Thank you for that, William. We'll have one more question as we're running out of time. We're actually past time, so we'll have one more question. So in the chat, we see, why is the US, especially under Samantha Powers, who have been vocal about US mistakes in stopping genocide, doing a similar mistake now? How is it that they had a fact-finding mission and claimed genocide on Ukrainians and not toward Tigrayans, which has taken longer? So I think this is an important question, as we see after a few weeks of the Ukrainian conflict, it was designated as a genocide by many American institutions, by even President Biden himself. But now we are in 18 months of the Tigray conflict, the deadliest conflict in the world, and there's no designation or any inclination of a designation of a genocide. So any of the four participants can answer this. I don't think we've heard from Dr. Gebissa, so we'll have him answer this question, and then we'll wrap up the discussion.
It's probably what the World Health Organization had said, that there is probably, what he said was that the world is not treating Black people and white people the same way. So there is probably an element of racism there. You could see all kinds of institutions responding, even cancer research centers responding to the children of Ukraine. Maybe it's also geopolitics, that this is in Europe. It is close to home. It affects people in Germany. It affects people in France. So geopolitics is probably the reason, but I agree. In most cases, the reason is that the international community does not have the mechanism to respond to needs around the world. Where they can, they would. When they are directly affected, they would. When they're not directly affected, it's a matter of statistics, all kinds of things.
Thank you. So with that, we will end our discussion today. We want to give a very big thank you to both William and Dr. Gebrehiwot. Dr. Gebrehiwot was currently inside of Tigray, was currently inside the region that is shut off from the world at this very late hour, was kind enough to join us and give us his insight and give us a situation of what it is on the inside of Tigray. William was able to make it up to this very late hour, give us his insight into different obstacles of peace. Meaza was able to join us despite her traveling challenges and flying across the country to join us and give an important talk on this important discussion. And Dr. Gebissa, who also graciously traveled to join us today. So with that, I want to give a very big thank you to all of them. That will end the portion for the virtual participants. We have some dinner available for everyone who's here in person to enjoy. And with that, we'll close. The big round of applause for all of our speakers who gave great presentations today.